I think we'll go ahead and get started. Haven't seen too many new folks popping up in the waiting room, so um, again, welcome to TASA's SASP, Sexual Assault Services Program Grant FY 26-27 Funding Opportunity Information Session. My name is Tim Love. I'm the Director of Finance, Grants, and Partnerships at TASA. Want to really thank you for taking time out of your schedule to join us for this information session. Thank you for your interest in applying for this grant. Been really excited to be able to be the pass-through for this grant for several years now, and very excited to be able to fund the great and important work that y'all are doing to support survivors of sexual assault. Many of you have been grantees in the past, some of you haven't. Thank you all for the work that you do. And for those of you who've been getting this funding, we really have enjoyed being able to have this kind of a relationship. Hopefully we're kinder, gentler grant administrators. At least that's the goal. Our goal is to support folks who are funded to be able to do the great work and to be able to focus that work on the folks who need it rather than worry too much about the administrative side of things, although of course all money comes from the federal government, so there's still a little bit of that, but we try to do our best to make that more collaborative, more communication based, and as minimal as we can in order to meet our own requirements from our funders. But again, thank you all so much for being here this afternoon. I'm going to turn it over and let Peggy introduce herself, and then we'll bring Annette on to get us started.
Hi, I'm Peggy Helton with the TASA Grant Administrative Team. So, Annette, I'll switch it to you.
Okay. Am I muted or am I on?
You're on.
Perfect. Okay, so I'm the SASP grant manager, but I'm actually a contractor with TASA, not on staff, not on site, which will explain why sometimes I am not necessarily the person who answers your emails at 8 in the morning on a Monday through Friday, and I will be answering emails at 11 p.m. and on Saturdays, so schedule can be a little bit different. We'll go ahead and get started, and Tim and Peggy will be jumping in as well to help explain things. So, and we also will have time for question and answers at the end as well. Now, even though we're doing things at the end, also feel free to put a question in the chat room if we get to an issue that is not being explained to your satisfaction, so that we can back up and make this as helpful as possible. So a little bit about this grant opportunity for those of you who may have been on one of the other grants that TASA administered and not the Sexual Assault Services Formula Grant Program, which goes by the acronym of SASP. I do want to say that also I know one of the grants out of the OAG's office also goes by the acronym SAS. I do want it on the record that we were using it first. But I do want to make sure that you realize the difference between those two grants, because I know occasionally folks will start asking us questions or sending us emails, especially if they're new to their organization, about the SAS grant that's with the AG's office, so that you realize the difference here. This is a federal grant that's received through the Texas Office of the Governor. TASA then is the pass-through agency that administers this program, which also does include the subcontracting with organizations to provide the grant activities, because obviously TASA is not doing those direct services. The following grant opportunity offered by TASA would be both grants to rape crisis centers, but also grants to some culturally specific programs that provide sexual assault victim services and help improve the access to kind of culturally specific sexual assault services to the adult survivors of sexual assault that were assaulted, as opposed to somebody who was assaulted by a family or household member. Okay. So just a couple of things about the grant priorities. We want to be as transparent as possible here. TASA will be using at least a third of these funds awarded for programs that will be implemented in border and rural communities. And we understand that some programs are actually serving communities that are both on the border and rural communities. This is not this is to give good geographic representation across the state. So we do reserve the right to make some adjustments in funding if we don't have those appropriate geographical areas covered. We want to make sure that we're increasing the accessibility of services to not only the underserved populations, but also to take into consideration past performance and the use of the funds awarded by TASA. So clearly, you know, we have a long track record with some programs for better or worse. And if that we can come into play, especially if we get into a situation with very close program scores, that we would have a situation where if we had a program that we had, you know, that was habitually late submitting things, had tons of problems before, obviously that would could impact the scoring. All right. This is a competitive grant, so no program that has a current grant, you know, has an advantage in this process. We expect to fund about 10 to 15 projects. We can't be any more clear about that right now because it's going to depend on how much those grants are written for and where they, again, fall in that ranking there on how many people could ultimately end up being funded, how many programs. The applicants will be scored on their responses by non-TASA staff. So just to explain it a little better, so TASA will go through, and not the entire, obviously, office, key people from TASA will be going through and determining the eligibility of the applications. So if folks end up applying for the grant who are not eligible to receive the funding, then they would be pulled out of that group of applications that then get scored. The folks that are scoring are folks who do know sexual assault. They have expertise in this area and in service delivery, but they are not associated with any current programs. They're not associated with TASA staff. So that we have some a better sense of objectivity here, that we're not you know, inadvertently playing favorites with anybody. With TASA being a membership organization, we certainly want to have that distance there so that we don't have folks who are assigning higher scores potentially because of a relationship with a program. Okay. So to be considered a rape crisis center, at least for the purposes of this funding opportunity, you must meet the definition of a rape crisis center that's in the funding announcement. You would meet the definition of a sexual assault program in Chapter 420 of the Texas Government Code. You would meet the Texas Minimum Services Standards, and you would either hold an OAG sexual assault training program certificate or have applied for one and anticipate being certified within 6 months of receiving the grant. And there'll be places where you'll be able to furnish that documentation to show that you're in that process. Okay. So a culturally specific organization is defined in the funding announcement. We are restricting it to current or former SASP or RSA grantees and those who are providing the SASP identified services to survivors of sexual assault. So this won't be a new pool of folks who are just wanting to start this work, coming in and competing with folks who have been providing this work for some time. Okay.
And Annette, just to
Yes.
make really sure and that folks understand, like basically the first thing you'll do is answer whether or not you fit the eligibility requirements of a rape crisis center. For that, you do not have to be a current grantee. But then if you are not a rape crisis center, but you are a culturally specific organization who's providing the grant related services, grant approved services, then you do have to be have been funded by TASA either through SASP or ARP at some point. So I just wanted to make clear, like if you're coming in as a rape crisis center, you don't have to be a former or current grantee.
Perfect. Thank you, Tim.
Mm-hmm.
As far as the project period, this grant would start October 1st of this year. It'll end September 30th of 27. So initially you will get funded for the 12-month period, but you can be refunded for a second year non-competitively. So if you end up with this grant award and you start doing the work, you, again, assuming that, you know, nothing crazy happens at the federal level, and money goes away or is redistributed or something else happens, you will be eligible to be funded the next year without writing another grant proposal. So fingers crossed that this is a 2-year grant here. The first year is the October 1st through September 30th of 26, and then the October 1st, 26 through 27. And yes, that leaves not a whole lot of time between when you write the grant and when the grant starts. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes, because we know that folks need to have those funding answers really quickly. Okay. So when you're writing your proposal, we need you to write a budget that has at least $40,000 in it annually, to a maximum of $150,000 a year. That would be same for both year 1 and year 2. I strongly encourage you to ask for as much money as you need to do the project and not more than you need to do the project. We, you know, end up with situations where folks will write for a more minimal award amount that doesn't seem to be sufficient for what they're planning on doing. I think that actually can hurt your score if you're not asking for the budget to support the work that you plan on doing. At the same time, you know, we have had a history of some people writing for the maximum amount because it's just the maximum amount, and then they have a very hard time utilizing those funds for direct services to sexual assault victims, adult victims, those kinds of things. So don't ask for more than you need, and please ask for as much as you need, if that makes sense there. Okay. We released the funding announcement, I think it'd be actually even a day or two before the 26th of June. The funding application was opened on July 7th. The final day to submit an application is going to be August 7th. We plan on having the notice of who has been awarded a grant by the 29th of August, and then the project start date will be October 1st. So a pretty tight timeline, pretty tight turnaround there. But you know, we're hoping that although the final day to submit an application is the 7th of August, that people don't wait until the 7th to try to get it all in. What we know is that folks sometimes have technical issues, questions, things that they don't reach out for assistance for until, I mean, literally 11 p.m. So we want to make sure that you're not waiting to the very last minute. You can get them into the 7th, but I wouldn't recommend you waiting to the 7th to do that in case you have any issues getting it submitted. Okay. And applications will be submitted using form assembly. So, you know, there's a specific link there. I actually have had plenty of feedback that folks think this is actually a pretty simple application. Okay, I heard. Okay, I'm hearing something, but I don't know if it's a question or it's not a question. But the feedback we've had is that it's a pretty simple application process. It's pretty straightforward. So I hope you find this application fairly simple as well. I think we took out a lot of things over the years that were redundant and unnecessary. And just know if it's in there and seems complicated, it's probably a federal requirement that we couldn't shake. So, you know, there'll be a few things in there like that, but for the most part, I think it's a pretty straight forward application. Okay. So a couple of the required documents that you will need with your application, we will need a signed board resolution. We also understand that sometimes because of when board meetings, regular board meetings are held, that this might be a problematic timeline. So, you know, there is a way to submit a placeholder that tells us when your board meeting is coming up and when you could have that to us. So we're trying not to make that a barrier to getting it in on time. Your job descriptions for staff on this grant, we need one for anybody that you're trying to pay out of this grant, a job description. We want to know about the SASP activities, and the percentage on the grant must be clearly marked on all the descriptions. This is to help us not to have to determine, especially with rural programs that may have administrators who are also doing direct services, and then later we're left to try to figure out whether this was a management function, this was a direct service function. So we just want it to be clearly delineated so that we're giving you, you know, proper credit for what it is. We understand that, you know, there's some agencies where the executive director is still taking call and going to the hospital for accompaniment and things like that. We don't want to see CEO and just assume that that is an administrative function. We want to kind of know what percentage of their time is being spent on these activities. We will need a work plan and a year one budget. You know, the work plan should contain enough detail that we can kind of look at it and figure out what you're doing from one quarter to the next. I would discourage you from just cutting and pasting, which is what I think some folks do when they get down to the last minute, where every quarter looks exactly the same. We know that you may be putting, for instance, you know, going to a conference. Well, if a conference is in the third quarter and that's money you spend, then I would put it on my work plan on the third quarter. If you don't have staff in place and you're going to be doing hiring for individuals, we know that that would probably happen in the first quarter of the grant. There may be differences between your workload on different quarters of the year, just based on your historical data at your agency. So you know, try to put in enough detail that it makes sense. At the same time, you know, we want to make sure that all staff that is on the budget is covered in the work plan, but we don't need a level of detail and specificity that doesn't fit in the blocks, you know. So let's we'll find that halfway medium there so we can look at it and understand it, and at the same time that it doesn't end up being a dissertation for you. We do need a confidentiality acknowledgement. We also would need your SATP certificate or a copy of your submitted application. And this, again, only applies to the rape crisis centers, not the culturally specific organizations that may be applying. But either your certificate or something that verifies that you have submitted a copy of that application to the OAG. Peggy, did I leave anything off there? Okay. And then a letter of commitment. This is more for programs who are going to be working with specific partners. If they've written that kind of into their grant, then we would want to see a commitment from those partners, and not just find out that you thought that was a really good idea, but you weren't going to talk to them until you found out you got the grant. Those things don't always work out. So again, that's an optional document, but if your project does depend on other partners in doing this work, then we'd want a letter of commitment from those partners. Okay.
And Annette, can I jump in on this one? So it can really look like, how are you prioritizing adult survivors of sexual assault that were assaulted by someone other than a family or household member? So really the focus on it should be, how are you prioritizing this? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it can be from your board as well, like a clear commitment that you're focusing on this particular population.
So it might be unfortunate that I'm referring to a letter of commitment for two different things with the same title, but thank you. All right. Okay, I see someone asked if we'd like a board resolution and a letter of commitment. So the letter of commitment, again, is an optional thing, and they would serve two different purposes from your board. Your board resolution is basically showing that your board is behind the project, is aware of the project, you know, knows what the funding is for, so that it's not a matter of just staff applying for something and the board is kind of clueless about the work that you're doing. So a resolution does that. The commitment letter, if it came from your board, is what Peggy and Tim were just referring to. Yeah, it can be signed by the chair only. Is more what Peggy and Tim were talking about, which basically would be particularly pertinent when you're talking about dual centers that have primarily historically done domestic violence work, showing that they are also committed to serving adult survivors of sexual assault and what that work would look like. Again, that is to kind of assure that we don't have a situation where you have boards who just think that we can get all our sexual assault victims from the domestic violence victims we're already working with. We don't really have to do anything any different. Or folks who have child ethics centers attached to them, and you have board members who then think that doing forensic interviews with young children should come out of your SASP funding, which we know is not an appropriate use of the funding. So it's just a way to show that the board is informed and fully informed and committed to doing this specific kind of work and not trying to move that money around to serve folks that the way they've always been doing it. Could we provide services to a non-offending parent? I think it went away. Let me see. Peggy, I can't see the question. It's
Oh,
snapped
I'm
off so
sorry.
close.
It says,
Can you-
could we provide
you-
services? Oh, I'm sorry. It says, could we provide services to a non-offending parent? An example, an aggressor is grandfather but doesn't live at home.
Okay, so yeah, yes, we can provide services to significant others, but I would say not at the exclusion of working with the survivor. Like this survivor, if it's a child under the age of 14, does not qualify for services. So it would be hard to qualify the non-offending parent of someone who doesn't qualify for services or potentially doesn't apply for services. I mean, obviously, if they're a 15 or a 16-year-old, and we'll talk about that a little bit in a minute, there are exceptions to this, but I would say if you're talking about working with providing services to a non-offending parent of a victim that does not qualify for services, I would say no. All right. So direct services to adult survivors of sexual assault, assaulted by someone other than a family or household member. So I think that's a little more clear cut. I think where it becomes a little bit confusing for folks comes when we're talking about adults who are molested as children. If you have an adult sexual assault survivor who was molested even within their home by a family member, but they're reaching out for services years later, they are eligible to receive services regardless of who victimized them. Again, because they're an adult sexual assault survivor. Okay.
So Annette, before we move on, I just want to make sure folks know there is an exception to this, and that is if you serve a survivor who was assaulted by a family member or household member, if the survivor seeks services for the sexual assault and the organization does not receive funds from HHSC, the Family Violence Program. Does that make sense? Under which, that survivor could get services if the organization was funded by HHSC. If that is not, then you could serve a person who was assaulted by a family member. Domestic violence services unrelated to the sexual assault can't be provided with this funding. So makes sense to everyone.
And I think we're going to talk about that a little more in a future slide. So, yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead and move that on. Rape crisis centers must provide SASP services to primarily adult survivors of sexual assault. We will, make some exceptions for teenagers because we understand that some of them are being sexually assaulted outside their home. They may be seeking services. They don't qualify for services through a child advocacy center. They're not trying to seek services in another way. It's most appropriate for them to be seeking services through your organization. So we don't want to cut those off completely. I can tell you if we start getting quarterly reports from your agency that's showing that, you served 11 people, in the 2 to 10-year-old age range, then that would be problematic. You would be asked to take those off of your report because that's not an appropriate use of this particular funding stream. And please know that any of this, whether we're talking about, other restrictions on this funding based on ages or, based on the type of service that you're providing is not to say that those services are not needed and valuable, but only that they can't be paid with this specific kind of funding because that's how the federal legislation was written. Culturally specific organizations must provide the SASP service primarily to adult survivors of sexual violence from those underserved populations. So, and the reason that we say that is if you had, well, we've never had one where you have a culturally specific organization who then just starts serving the community at large, and then somehow, cuts in on the exact same services that the Rape Crisis Center is providing. Those culturally specific organizations are serving adult survivors of sexual violence, but from those specific populations that are looking for services for them, tailored for them from organizations that are like them. Okay. Primarily adult survivors of sexual assault who are assaulted by someone other than a family or household member. Again, we want to make sure that you know that a limited amount of your services can be to, those young teens, those young adults and teens that are 14 to 17. But you cannot serve children under the age of 14 on this funding. This is not a TASA rule. This is a federal rule, and it is one of those things that we will, verify on reporting because it will be flagged. An exception, which is what Peggy talked about a couple of slides ago, is organizations who are not receiving HHSC funding, which is mostly our standalone rape crisis centers who may be in areas that they are the only folks who are providing those services to anyone who is sexually assaulted, whether that was inside or outside the home. So if they're not receiving HHSC funding for domestic violence, they can provide those services to those adults. Okay.
Annette, if I could just add real quick, like one of the ways to think about like in your application, this piece about serving primarily adult survivors, but there is a space for some limited services with teens and young adults is like, if your application includes like a child or teen counselor at 100%, then that's the kind of thing that we need to steer clear from with this funding. So it doesn't mean you can't fund somebody who's doing a focus primarily on young people, but that shouldn't be most of the direct services that you're providing. So those are the kinds of things that, that we would be looking for in applications, and then once programming gets implemented.
Thanks. And I know, y'all are not, attending this webinar to have a history lesson, but I can tell you that, the rationale for that when this funding was developed is because there were a lot of communities around the country who cared about, they cared about kids, but they didn't care about adults. So they would take all the sexual assault funding that was available, and all of it was directed towards child sexual abuse, and none of it was taking care of adult survivors. And so when this funding was, first kind of imagined and then supported and advocated for, it was to fill that void that we were seeing around the country. So we want to make sure, that we are being true to that vision, because there were funds that were available for the other pieces. All right, let me go ahead and, so ineligible activities and expenses, I would pay particular attention to page 10 of the funding announcement, because that will give you the kind of the clearest guidelines on what kinds of things that money can be spent on. and what kinds of things are eligible on this grant. You know, we'll probably get to these on the next slides as well, but some of those things are like education and prevention work. Again, incredibly valuable programming, very important, but it's not going to be considered a direct service to survivors and would not be allowable on this grant. Out of scope activities, again, page 10 and 11. In fact, if any of you are awarded these grants, and hopefully that is going to be the exact situation that happens here, save this funding announcement, because this funding announcement, I find I send to grantees sometimes, you know, multiple times a year, because they will ask a question that is still in the funding announcement from when they applied for the grant. We know there's a lot of turnover at agencies and that type of thing. So, you know, it's always going to be a good place to go back and use as a reference when you're trying to decide whether this fits the criteria or doesn't fit the criteria. So it's helpful for writing this grant. It'll be helpful afterwards when you're awarded the grant. If you're awarded, yeah.
Oh,
Were you saying something?
This is just kind of where I wanted to jump in and make very clear these out of scope activities, in many cases, not all of them, but most of them are new. So if you're currently funded, these are new things. These are, we want to make very clear they do not represent TASA values. They are definitely in many cases connected back to executive orders at the federal level and institutionalizing those into federal funding. So I am actually going to read a few. I'm not going to read all of them. I really encourage you to read them carefully. Think through, you know, whether you can meet those, because what we know is that this federal funding is under a pretty significant microscope right now and is being looked at very carefully. And so we're gonna need to pay very close attention to folks being in alignment with these make sure that nobody's doing these out of scope activities so that we don't put the funding at risk and therefore put survivors at risk. So again, just going through a few of them. There's restrictions around inculcating or promoting gender ideology as defined in one of the executive orders around defending women from gender ideology extremism and restoring biological truth in the federal government, promoting or facilitating discriminatory programs or ideology, including illegal DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility programs that do not advance the policy of equal dignity and respect. For all, the prohibition is not intended to interfere with any of OVW's statutory obligations, such as funding for HBCUs, culturally specific services, and disability programs. Activities that frame domestic violence and sexual assault as systemic social justice issues rather than criminal offenses. So, for example, prioritizing criminal justice reform and social justice theories over victim safety and offender accountability. This particular grant is very focused on direct services to survivors, but that is still one of the requirements that folks have to sign on for. So just to say a little bit about those, we've asked some pretty straightforward questions to the governor's office. And there, we don't want folks to like overcorrect out of fear. You absolutely can provide services to everyone. As long as the services that they're coming in for are connected to sexual assault, to their victimization or their survivorship and their healing, So this should not be something that makes you feel like you need to restrict who you can provide services to. As long as you're providing services to everyone, that also gives you a little wiggle room, recognizing that not everyone can access or receive those services in the same way, and that some services may need to look a little different. Again, as long as you're not prioritizing any one population, certainly culturally specific organizations are many times prioritizing certain groups, but already federal requirements require you to provide services to anyone who shows up at your door. So I don't want people to overcorrect out of fear of meeting these, and we do just want to call these to folks' attention because these are new. And again, wanted to make very clear that they're coming from the federal government. Additionally, there are a couple, these are not necessarily new, but they are, because they are included in these out of scope activities, we know that it's something that the federal government's kind of paying close attention to. So there are restrictions around activities focused on prevention efforts and education. So for example, bystander intervention, social norms campaigns, presentation on healthy relationships, etc. Was never the purpose of this funds was never to do that anyway, but we just want to make sure that folks really pay attention to that. And then providing training to allied professionals in the community. So law enforcement, child protection services, prosecution, community-based organizations, etc. So just to say a little bit more about education, so like prevention or like sexual assault 101, those types of community education, they're just flat not allowed regardless of who the audience is. Training for professionals not allowed. There's a little bit of flexibility specifically for culturally specific organizations to do a minimal amount of outreach to get information out into the community about the services that are being provided for sexual assault survivors. But the key focus of the grant should still be on direct services, even in that case. So essentially no education or outreach for programs that come in as sexual assault programs or rape crisis centers. And for culturally specific programs, there's a very small bit of wiggle room, but it's got to be focused on just getting information out about sexual assault services that are available. And it needs to be a kind of a small piece of the work. Again, this is not to deprioritize the importance of education work and outreach work. It's just this particular funding stream is not now and hasn't really ever been kind of intended to focus on that. And then the last thing I'll just mention is that legal services, that is a new thing that they're restricting. Traditionally, folks haven't spent a lot of money on that, but there have been a few times where folks have asked about being able to support legal service for survivors, and those are things that are now on the out of scope activities for this grant.
Thank you, Tim. You can do that with less snark in your voice than I do, so I appreciate you, sharing the news. So you will have your authorized official that will certify that you're not going to be using these funds for your out-of-scope activities. There will be a template that TASA will provide that you can use if you are interested. He already talked about the new and revised certifications to an extent. So there will be a few documents that you're signing off on that if you are a current grantee that you may not recognize as something that you've had to do in the past. So please, go through those and make sure that you're familiar with them, that you're comfortable with what you're signing, and that you kind of understand. And I think Tim did a good job of explaining where this is a situation that a lot of folks are feeling pretty fearful and uncomfortable with, and at the same time, don't be immobilized by that where you don't feel like you can do any of that work. We need to continue to serve the folks that need to be served. Just the way we market it and talk about it may be different. So, you know, be careful with that as well. Was there anything you wanted to add on any of the revised certificates, Tim?
So,
All right.
Annette, someone asked
Yeah.
you to please share the template. And the template that we're talking about is if you're funded, you'll be signing off on the out of scope activities, and we'll send that, I guess, document for you to sign after award. So with your contract, I believe, right, Tim?
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, yes, I was typing a response in the chat, but yeah, if you look at pages 10 through 11 at the out of scope activities, you'll have a pretty good idea of what that template's going to end up looking like. We're actually waiting one from the governor's office because, you know, this things travel downstream, right? Downhill. And so first, the governor's office will have to see exactly what sort of format they have to sign, and then they'll give us something that we have to sign as TASA. And they have already told us that we'll be required to pass that on in some way to y'all. So we're not sure what that exact template will look like, so we'll wait until folks are funded. But if you're worried about it, you want to make sure that you're comfortable with it. If you look at it, there won't be anything that's in that template that's not on pages 10 through 11 of the funding announcement in the out of scope activities section.
So some of the things that are new to SASP, the confidentiality acknowledgement, I don't think that's going to be problematic for anyone, because we know that folks have been operating under, you know, a presumption of confidentiality for as long as rape crisis centers have been around. So, and anybody who's a current grantee would also understand that, but it is new to this particular grant as far as expectations that are put out in a document.
Yes, ma'am, I will.
Okay. Grant activities designation. So this actually, I think, is probably a little piece of good news that'll be appreciated by folks who are current grantees. We're trying to simplify things a little bit. I know it was difficult for some folks to say, well, is this a direct, you know, is this administrative? Is this overhead? Just the whole identifying expenses. So what we did is now all budget items will be determined by whether they're a direct service or whether they're another activity in support of the direct service. Previously, the amounts were like 10%, and then there was an additional amount that could go for training and travel. Now it's kind of all put in together and has been increased, which I know is going to be good news for a lot of the CEOs and CFOs and folks who've been writing in saying, you know, that being able to pay the expenses like the phones and the computers and the rent and all those kinds of things, that there was just an insufficient amount of money on this grant to be able to support the folks who are actually doing the direct services. So now it can't exceed 35% of your total grant award. And there's just kind of like two categories it's put in. It's the direct service or it's the other activities in support of that direct service. I think that's going to make it a little bit easier for you to not only develop a budget, but be able to track your budget and stuff as the grant year proceeds. survivor support, so that supplies kept on hand for survivors, items that were purchased for specific survivors, third-party payments made on behalf of survivors, that type of thing. We will have, that can't exceed 10% of your grant, so that will be on top of the 35%. So that's a similar number from before, but I think it makes it a little bit easier having them kind of all in one category there. And, there'll be a way to be able to log those expenses. And obviously there's a criteria for those expenses, but that's also can be found in the funding announcement.
Annette, can I jump in just for a minute? So when you
Yes.
fill out the budget, it is going to look different because there's going to be 2 additional categories on the budget for direct services and then other activities in support of direct services. Some you're going to fill out yourself, like personnel and fringe, like how much of this person, if they're, let's say they're on the grant 50%, how much of that 50% are they on direct services and other activities? There's some activities that we have already identified as other activities in support of direct services. So when you put those kinds of activities in, like rent or training or travel, then they will automatically be like put in that column for other activities in support of direct services. At the bottom of that budget, you're going to see those percentages. And so if it's too high, let's say for other activities, it'll like come and become red, and you'll know that, that you're over that 35%. So there's some things built into that budget that's going to look different that will help you determine these 2 categories.
I think that's also going to help people after the fact, if they are awarded and they want to put in a budget adjustment later, to kind of know where you're already at. Because right now, generally I go in and figure it out every time you ask for a budget adjustment, so I can see whether you're already at your percentage or not, and you'll be able to see that for yourself. Okay. So reports are also completed in form assembly, except for the annual report, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But which means, again, it's a fairly simple thing. The quarterly reports don't take a ton of time. The annual report's a little bit different because there's more demographic data in there, and so it does require more effort on your part. But the quarterly reports, here's the due dates. You will see that the first quarter is kind of screwed because it only has 2 months. Again, that's because, the Fed set the quarterly time frame, but the grant money isn't available to go out until October 1st. And the first quarter says it starts September 1st. So that may work for some states, but it does not work for Texas. So when you look at your data, know that that first quarter is only 2 months, and TASA is very aware that 2 months doesn't make a quarter, but we're just trying to follow, the guidelines the feds give us, no matter how, nonsensical those might be. So it's a little bit shorter of a time, and you will pick up the September from the next year. There'll be a way to pick that up on a multi-year grant. Some of those who got a grant before and didn't get one this year will be providing the September data with their last year's quarters. So, it gets a little bit complicated, but just know 2 months, and that is intentional. That's not an oversight on our part or a misprint. And then the others, are full quarters. Tight time frames, because again, we know the end of February to the 13th of March is just 2 weeks. The only thing I can say is for those of you who have not received a SASP grant before, to know that those reports don't take an excessive amount of time to do. And hopefully that's some consolation for that really type timeframe. But that wasn't determined by TASA. That was determined, by the folks at the state, and we're just following orders there. The annual report, which is, the bane of my existence because it's on a calendar year, which makes no sense. It should be on a grant year. I'm full of opinions and they didn't ask me that, but, so the annual report always, bridges two different grant years, that makes no sense. But if you did not receive, the grant in the, part of that year, let's say you didn't get the grant till October, you may have only 3 months that you'll report on your annual report if you did not have a grant the previous year. If you did have a grant the previous year, you will be using grant data from that year added to the grant data of the new years on there. And then it will all come together on a nice little long form that is provided by OVW and that you will be doing online through their system. Again, not a particularly complicated report, but certainly a little harder to pull together because you are pulling together multiple years, and it does include demographic data, so it is a little bit more complicated. The good news is usually they will have the report template available sometime in early January. It usually isn't due until mid-February, so you usually have 4 or 5 weeks to get that one completed. So it does give you a little bit more time than the quarterly reports to pull together. We did not put a date on that particular one because, again, we're always at the mercy of the feds and they decide when it's due. We can only tell you historically when they're usually due. And we had 1 year when they changed the forms, and so it wasn't due till like May. So I don't know what to tell you. Tim, have you heard anything more concrete about when that one might be due? Yeah.
No.
Anything?
And generally, my gut feeling is that it'll go one of two ways. Either they're going to use exactly what they have in place, or they're going to take their time figuring things out just because so much is kind of, there's so much
Changed?
like flux and turmoil federally as far as grant requirements and what they want reported and who actually works at the federal agency. So I'm hopeful. They moved to a new system last year, so I'm hoping they won't move to a new system again this year. So I would think we will know in December or January, but I wouldn't bet on that. Don't hold me to it, please.
Yeah, the feds don't move too quickly, which may be to our advantage this time. I think probably they'll go at least this first year of a new administration with the old form, and then all bets will be off the next year. So don't know, but as soon as we do know, we will give you a timeline. Just know that for the annual report, you should get a good 4 or 5 weeks notice on completing that one, and I'm sure it's going to include a lot of similar information to the one that you've been doing. And that's used for all OVW grants, which is why they may ask questions about activities you can't even do on SASP. You're putting lots of zeros in there. So something to look forward to.
Annette, there's
All right.
Annette, there's a question. Data reporting is not financial, just programmatic. Is that right?
That is correct.
Yeah, no, I was just working on a response to that one too. So the quarterly reports are just programmatic. You will have to submit a request for reimbursement, but we have that through online system monthly. There's very limited, like we don't ask for backup documentation with the exception of some reporting a little bit of backup documentation on, items purchased for survivors or supplies kept on hand or third-party payments on behalf of survivors. That's the only thing we require some monthly documentation on to go with your request for reimbursement. It is likely that most folks over a 2-year cycle, we usually audit about a third to half folks each year. And so we plan on kind of continuing that just because that's one of the things we're required to do to be a pass-through is to do some auditing. So at that point, we might ask for more for financial documentation, but there's nothing on a regular basis where you would have to submit that.
Okay, are there any other questions that popped up?
Somebody asked earlier, I kind of answered it, but can you please let me know who would fill out the civil rights? So it asks for a civil rights liaison on the application. Again, that's one of those things that gets passed down to us federally through the governor's office, and then that we have to pass on. You get to decide who that is. Generally, and there's not a lot of work connected to that designation necessarily. Generally, folks have used like if they have a staff attorney or HR staff. If you're a smaller organization, usually it's somebody from like executive or leadership staff, but it doesn't have to be somebody with like a law degree or anything like that. It's just somebody who's kind of taking responsibility and can be a point person if staff have concerns about civil rights, as well as the folks that you provide services to. And then Shelby was asking, are both quarterly programmatic and financial billing and financial reports to go in form assembly, or Salesforce not being used? So we are using Salesforce again for all the financial components. So submitting your request for reimbursement, doing budget adjustments, all of those kinds of things, as well as your ability to kind of pull reports on what you've submitted and what's been reimbursed. All of that will still be in Salesforce. Programmatic reporting will be in form assembly, except for the annual report, which goes through a federal online form. And then generally, if you have to submit the backup documentation that I mentioned, then we would we use Drop Secure just to make sure that there's a level of data security to that for folks to submit the documentation of, again, third-party payments on behalf of survivors, specific supplies purchased for survivors, or supplies kept on hand for survivors. That's also if you happen to be an organization that's chosen to be audited, that will also, all of that will be submitted through Drop Secure.
And I see somebody asked a question on the number of budget adjustments you can do per year. We do not have a limit on budget adjustments. So we'll keep looking at them.
Please don't do one every month. And yeah, there's no limit from on our end.
Yeah, some people do them more than once a month. So I think Tim's right. Try to be rational in the number of times you use them, but we also understand things come up, circumstances change, staff leave. We want to make sure that you do as many as you need to be able to function. So your client assistant tracking log for expenses related to survivor support. So we were just talking about that. We will provide a tracking log for you so that you know what kinds of things need to be logged in and what we're looking for, and then have those submitted 3 days prior to your RFR, if at all possible, because that will that will keep us on track and not slow down your reimbursements that way. I would be having questions of what you put in your tracking log. We're not slowing down. If you submit those at the exact same time, if we have any questions, then we may be up against your deadline. And we have to have those by the 15th, or you get put into the next group that goes in, and that's you know, that's another month. And we know for some agencies that can be problematic to wait for those reimbursements. So this, you know, may seem a little burdensome, but it's actually a way to make sure your reimbursements get to you on time. Okay, next. So helpful documents, again, if you go to TASA.org/grants, you will find all the SASP grant announcements in there. So the full funding announcement is in there, the grant application questions, the grant application instructions. I think that might be helpful sometimes to just have those things printed out so that if you have any questions, you feel you've either had those answers or you feel more confident after looking at the instructions before you go in and actually start filling out your application. Not telling you how to do it, whatever works for you is fine, but we from experience have found that people that look at those, you know, early tend to have more of an opportunity to reach out to TASA staff and ask questions and get clarification on some of that. Thank you, Tim. I see that you also put the FAQs up there. So that's it has been put up on the website since the last little training that we did on this, and a lot of it is based on the questions that we were getting from folks that attended. So we hope that that's helpful. But if your questions are not answered looking at that, don't hesitate to let us know. We can't look at your proposal and you know, critique it for you, tell you how you did. We can't help you write it, but we certainly can clarify your questions and make sure that, you know, you're understanding the instructions and that we're all on the same page there. So, all right, anything else? So already talked about reviewing the funding announcement, develop your project using the funding announcement. That helps plan the activities. We find your work plan is a lot better if you're, again, having that funding announcement out. Use the link to the form assembly that is posted on the TASA Grant Administration website. You know, to reiterate, don't wait to the last minute to submit. It seems like almost every year there's like one person who has a problem with their computer system goes down on the last day, and we can't make any exceptions to take it in later. So, you know, please plan for that ahead of time. We hate that those things happen, and we certainly feel bad when we tell you no, but we will tell you no, that we can't take them in late. And then await your funding decision. Again, we fully anticipate having that done by the 29th. You know, we've been on time past years, and so we're certainly hoping that we don't have any issues that come up that keep us from our own deadlines either. We want to give you as much time as possible to prepare, whether you're you know, somebody who's currently a grantee or you're wanting to know whether you need to be hiring new folks. We want to give you as much time as possible, and we know that this is already a very constricted timeline. So we will do our best to give you as much time as possible for that planning. Okay. If you use the SASP@TASA.org, both now, if you have questions on an existing grant or for the grant application, the good thing is that Peggy and Tim and I all see the emails that come in at SASP@TASA.org. And that means that they tend to get answered more quickly because there's multiple people looking at it. That also means when you ask a question and you're not quite sure which person is the best person to give you an answer, that multiple people are seeing that, and you know, people can jump in if they're the best person to be answering your questions. So, and it kind of holds us accountable because if we see a question that went up that I think, you know, Tim should have answered, but Tim didn't answer, then I can reach out to Tim and say, you want me to answer this? Is this the correct response? So it's just a way to make sure your answers, your questions get answered on a more timely basis. I can be reached at that cell phone number right there. If I don't answer your call when you call, please leave a message, text me, whatever, because you know, I may be at another meeting or can't pick up the phone at that time, but I will assure you that I will call you back, and have called people back again on the weekends, at night. It depends on what kind of emergency is. And I know when you're writing a grant, things can seem like an emergency. So I will do my best to always respond to you quickly. Again, we can answer the general questions on the grant and programming. We can't assist you writing the grant or provide an assessment of how good the grant is that you just wrote. So, you know, just know that we're going to do what we can do within the parameters of what's allowed. All right. Are there any other questions? And thank you for the questions that have come in already, because those are very helpful.
Yeah, we had a couple of questions. One is, how might I add a row for staff positions? Is that possible? Part of the reason that we put 15 lines on there is that we want to make sure that we don't have a bunch of staff at really small percentages. So we kind of put that number in there intentionally to kind of limit so that there are not too many staff on a grant. So we wouldn't be able to add another line for that. And then will the webinar slides be emailed to us? We can certainly, we're gonna, Peggy, I'm right, we're gonna email the recording of this one to everyone who's here. The recording of the first one we did is available on our website. We can also send the slides with that email, and Peggy, we could probably even talk to Shelby about putting those up on the website as well. It might take a few days. He's been out sick, but so if you're here, you're registered, and have your contact info, then we will send you the recording for this one and the slides within a few days. And then we'll also work on getting the slides up on the website as well. Other questions from folks? And you can use the text chat, or you can also just unmute yourself and ask away.
Well, if you think of them after the fact, which is when I usually do, don't hesitate to give us a call or send us an email, and we'll shoot you back an answer as quickly as possible.
Just to reiterate, and then Irene, I see that your hand is raised. I just really encourage folks to use all those documents that are on the website. Like, all of the questions are on there. Form assembly is built in such a way that you can go in and start it and then save it and go back to it later. I would just really encourage you to read fully the funding announcement, look through all the application questions and guidance and instructions before you get started, and potentially even kind of fill out your application, like answer your questions outside of form assembly, and then put them in there. One thing we have had some questions about is we've had folks wondering about getting a copy. If you will reach out to us once you have submitted your, at the SASP at TASA.org email, once you have submitted your application, and let us know you'd like a printed copy, we can send one back to you. I think folks that have, if you haven't submitted it yet, you might be able to have an option to do that. No. Yeah, I forgot. We had a little bit of a tech issue, so unfortunately you won't be able to print it out when you're done. But if you reach out to us, we're happy to send you the final submitted application.